to Katie.
Right, thank you. Kev, just once I start sharing, I won't be able to see the chat, so just keep an eye also as to whether I'm actually referring to the things that people most want to get out of it.
Yeah, no worries.
Right, so I'm just going to. Oh, also you need to allow me to share my screen.
That would help, wouldn't it? Sorry. Yeah. Right, 1 second.
I'll act it out if you like.
I love your improvisation. There you go. I'll just do that now. Hold on a second.
Hope everyone's okay, not too cold.
You're now a presenter, Katie.
Well, got it.
Lovely, thank you.
Okay, so this is the sort of third instalment really of just a bit more guidance, training, or opportunity for discussion around this this way of working and this framing of evaluation. If this is the first session you've attended with me, then we are building on some of the previous slides and previous videos, but obviously always happy to go over some of the key tenets for anybody that needs a refresher or is has not been able to attend those previous sessions or see the recordings. So I'm presenting on behalf of the NELP Consortium. Kev, as you know, there's a few others of us around, and it's very much a team effort, even though I sometimes front these sessions. The kind of one of the highlights, just to get everybody back into the sort of this way of thinking, is these challenges that we have to accept, I think, in terms of understanding complex systems. Because of the vast number of influences interacting, it's true to say that there aren't any sort of silver bullets, and particularly with this work where you are operating over multiple layers of social structure, then it's really hard to kind of always distinguish exactly what your interventions are doing or what your activities are doing compared to what's just really generally going on in the world. So what does this mean for evaluation? It means that sometimes the really conclusive, research designs that are looking to isolate the effects of an intervention are quite challenging. But it does mean that we just because there are lots of influences, it doesn't mean that there aren't any sort of discernible patterns in the ways in which things interact and the conditions and features of systems that seem to work in certain circumstances, and perhaps those might change in other circumstances. So what we really focus on is trying to get more of an explanatory account, trying to understand more about those complex interactions and the patterns that we might see emerging from the work. I do have this privileged position of being able to look across the work, and it is really clear to me that there are some patterns emerging. And when you speak to other people in the learning clusters or in other settings, you probably do see the familiar kind of patterns of events that seem to sort of cross contexts. But then we also have really unique contexts in certain places, which mean that we need to pay attention to, how and why and in what circumstances do some things work in some places and not in others. So we're really focusing on this graph, we're really focusing in on the explanatory accounts and trying to explain how and why change may or may not be occurring in your work. A tiny quick refresher on what do we mean by explanatory frameworks. So basically those are there to help us understand the kinds of things that we might be interested in. They don't on their own explain change, they just kind of outline the items and things that might be useful to get an understanding of. And what we mean by explanatory accounts is that that's the sort of more detailed theory which explains the relationships between some of the things that we're interested in. So they're the ones that actually tell us either our ideas about how we expect our actions to lead to change or outcomes, depending on your terminology that you might use. And then when we collect data, we're comparing our data against those assumptions to see the extent to which our assumptions were borne out, or whether in fact we need to change our understanding of how these things work in practice. So I'm not going to go over the detail of these slides, but I'm just bringing us back up to speed, I hope. So what makes a good explanatory framework? Bear in mind that we're talking about really what's of interest to us in our evaluation. So it needs to be sufficiently inclusive of the ideas and the things that we're interested in, and maybe at a level which allows us to share the meaning across multiple contexts. So by that I mean it's not really super specific to just one example of one thing in one place, but it's more at an abstract level, which gives us a chance to kind of compare across different contexts. And there's an attention to trying to unify some of the items that are of real interest. But bear in mind, what we know about systems is that they are not closed, and that there is fluidity, that things influence into those systems, like the wider context, like a global pandemic, for example, and that actually the system itself may be influencing the context around it. So some of these ideas are just helping to provide a bit of mental architecture for your thinking. It doesn't mean that I'm saying in reality we can definitely draw a clear boundary around a system and then that's it. It's not it's immovable. We have to remember there is some fluidity in and out. And then what makes a good program theory? Like any theory, you know, it should be testable. There should be something about it that allows you to kind of you know, to test the assumptions within it. But because we're trying to get under the skin of what it is that is making that change, we want it to be quite detailed, to focus on underlying processes of change and what we describe as configurational. So that's not just saying that we, you know, let's take education, peer education as an example. It's not just saying that if you have somebody who is like you or similar to you as a mentor or as a teacher, then you're more likely to learn. You know, that's a theory. If someone's similar to you that's teaching you, then you're more likely to learn. That might sort of stand alone, but we're really interested in the context in which that might be brought together. So you know, in what circumstances does that work, and in what circumstances actually do you want an authority figure to be teaching you to be able to learn? So we're really looking for sort of configurations of features in our theories. So I know I'm just really brushing over that, and that's quite a lot in one go, but now I'm going to take us into some examples to try to really help bring that to life. Is there any sort of moments of clarity for now, just so that people can stay with me?
I'm just looking at the chat, Katie. There's a few questions that probably would be good to come after you've presented these. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in now with anything that Katie's just said. We'll press on, but just do unmute and shout at me if you need to. Okay, so I'm gonna present from the GM moving process evaluation, and as I say, this is a piece of work that I've been working on for a few years, so obviously I'm familiar with it. It's not to say it's the only good example or the shining example. It's really just because I'm more familiar with it, so I can answer questions about it. So for quite a number of years now, we've been working around thinking about conditions for change at quite an abstract level. And in Greater Manchester Moving, they've adopted these 5 sort of general conditions, as it were, as their enablers of change. And they see these working across lots of different contexts in that which they're working. If any of you are familiar with the NELP conceptual model, which is the 3 boxes, the green and the yellow and the brown box, then I would say that this primarily relates to work that happens in the green box around sector integration of physical activity, but it does reach into the yellow and the brown box when thinking about how they work with communities in place. So just to orientate you in the NELP conceptual model, I'm just kind of trying to draw the distinction there. But actually, this tends to be our organising framework for the GM moving work, just these 5 kind of enablers for change, as they call them. When we send the slides out, these are all linked to short videos narrated by me, so you might have to listen to my voice going on again, which actually explains some of the program theory that sits underneath, or the explanatory accounts that sits underneath these kind of broader headings. I'm not going to go into the detail of that now, but that's just to give you a kind of sense of how we've sort of worked with these different scales, the explanatory framework at this high level, and then the program theory that's in at a lower level. Louise,
have you got a link to some of these so we can see the video?
Yeah, so I can click. You can just click through a control and click on this to go into the video. I'm going to try and see if I can do it then. Oh, just a click. So I'm not. Is this? Are you still seeing my screen?
Yeah.
So I don't know if I'm sharing my voice.
Yeah, we can't hear.
It probably isn't. If you're going to share these slides with us anyway, so that we can have a look. I think one of the things for me is that kind of translational aspect. I mean, simple translational aspect of how best to visualize and represent what is really, really complex theory, and thinking about the different audiences who might want to access it. I know this is a bigger question, but it'd be just good to see how you've done it, because that's what I'm finding really difficult.
Yeah, so you can see with this, what I've attempted to do is to build up that kind of theory in time, giving the context, the descriptions with it, and illustrating it with examples. So that's what I've attempted to do there.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant, but I think it's, well, there's another, it's for it wouldn't be accessible for every audience who might want to see this. So that's also something about how we might have to do this differently in Southall for different audiences.
I completely accept that, and I think that's let's keep that in mind as we go through. No, not at all. I just I want to respond to what you're saying, and that's why when I show, for example, if I show in Birmingham's submission as well, it's a little bit more narrative based. There's some examples that bring it to life. It's with pictures and that kind of thing. So the first example that I'm going to give is from the GM report, which is for a more for a more professional audience, shall we say, or even an academic audience.
Yeah.
And then Birmingham's example, again, whilst there's some detail there, it's probably got a bit more of the story focus at the front. So
I wonder as if you could kind of connect the two, where people could go in and connect to a digital story, because we're doing some work around digital storytelling. I think there's loads of scope. So yeah, right, I'm going to shush.
No, this is really helpful, and to be honest, this is why we want to do this session, is to be able to explore the opportunities. And you'll see when I share my report, I was looking at it today and going, well, I know the steps I've gone through and the data that I want to present, but actually it does look very dry. And and so that kind of why I wanted to show it is to illustrate the components that we think that are important, but it's not to say that this is the only way of displaying that information. So what we did in the October report is just a deep dive into this one, effective work across and between sectors, and we're now thinking about what is the leading edge of this work in Greater Manchester. So I think we can talk around in circles about how it's important to work across sectors and it's important to work in collaboration. And I think I can't imagine that anybody on the call would disagree with that as a general premise. If we're trying to, do things differently or build physical activity priority in place. So what we were trying to focus on is what was new that we wanted to share, that we'd learned in that previous 6 months. So we organised a chapter, and I'm going to show it to you in a moment. We organised a chapter around what we already knew, and then what this section adds, just in a box at the start. And then really trying to drill down into what we were hoping that would happen and what the working assumptions were about that change. And then we go into more of a deep dive. So then just taking one example in place, giving a detailed description of what has been happening. So this is where you can do a rich description, but then also an explanation. And the explanation is built out of the raw data, qualitative data, working with stakeholders. How would you explain this change? As well as our own inferences and reflections back on what have we seen elsewhere. So that's supported with evidence. In this round, it's documentary and evidence and interview data. In other rounds, when we have survey data and other quantitative kind of frequency measures, then we would integrate it all around the theory. Again, I will go into this so you can see it in a moment. And that then leads to where we might have started with a kind of rough working assumptions here, a kind of rudimentary explanatory account, shall we say, then we can actually refine that explanatory account based on our testing it in a real situation. And then in Greater Manchester, we have this situation where there's 11, actually there's like 11 little mini pilots around the local authority areas. So what we do is a local sense making session where we present a story and present a theory and then compare and contrast around what's actually really making the difference. Why are we seeing a change here and we're not seeing a change in our other places? And that allows the groups and the stakeholders within these different places to actually compare and contrast about what feels like the difference that actually makes a real difference. So that's the structure that we've used for the chapter. Just forgive me, I'm just going to swap screens onto the report. And again, I'm not going to expect you to be able to read everything in the report, but just to kind of run through and give you some examples of how that's been pulled out. Okay, here I go. Okay, so as I say, we've got this kind of timeline almost in terms of what we already knew. And that just runs the information that's been presented in previous reports, actually. And one of the things that came back from feedback from Bradford was that what they're thinking about doing in their next report is, rather than kind of deep dive into a whole different area, actually build on the explanatory account they gave in October, but illustrated with more knowledge, more nuance, more cases from across the Bradford pilot. And that's our attempt there, is to start to build up this sense of what do we know about how these things tend to work. The example I'm going to talk to you, though, is about sustainable collaboration. So it's specifically a piece of work in Salford that's been going on over a number of years, where the Physical Activity Community Leisure Trust, Salford Community Leisure, have been working closer and closer and closer with the youth service in Salford, such that now they would say they have a sustainable collaboration where, in a way, they work as a blended team. And this has reciprocal benefits for both themselves as a community leisure trust, because they're reaching more young people in more challenging circumstances, in more areas of deprivation, which is what they want to really focus on, as well as the youth service being able to have different ways of working with those young people, offering positive opportunities for them by working with the Community Leisure Trust. But that, in terms of, whilst that makes intuitive sense on paper, the actual work to work sustainably in a collaborative fashion has taken a long time. And so this is an account of what's really been going on there. So we've got a kind of overarching idea about why even is this a good idea in the first place. You know, we've been working in silos for years and we want to work collaboratively. You know, and so just really highlighting at a very high level, what's the point of this? You know, to raise priority and value of physical activity, to reduce the sort of siloed transactional working, you know, ideally to pool resources, create more effective physical activity opportunities, and to connect physical activity to key audiences where they meet other professionals. So that's the sort of rationale. Why would we want to do this? And actually, if we were successful, we might see some of these things happening in the outcomes that we're capturing in our data. And so I'm not going to go into loads of detail on this. You can see the detail is in there now in terms of, you know, what's going on, what's the context in which this is operating? And the context is really important for us at national evaluation level, because we want to be able to share and understand what is a common pattern, which kind of seems to be happening everywhere, irrelevant to the context, and where is it contextually specific. So just giving that paragraph on the background and the wider context is really helpful. The relevant thing here was that in Salford, they had an example, just one example of a successful collaboration, and this actually formed a foundation and a basis from which further collaboration could transpire, because people had conviction that it was a successful way of working. Then have described what's happening, using the words of the interviewees and in where it's relevant to. And also sharing what they felt was important, you know, when, okay, so you've got a kind of working relationship with the youth service here. What has been the important aspects of what the local pilot has afforded that has led to that that sort of sustained collaboration? And here the suggestions were, you know, actually just paying for time allowed them the opportunity to ring fence the opportunity for collaboration, rather than paying for the delivery of a service where the focus is on the delivery of the service rather than the building of the relationship. You know, the ethos of the local pilot being about coming to shared solutions rather than you know, just doing what we've always done because that's what we're used to and we're comfortable about doing. Linking in with the principles that are actually present in Salford at the moment. There's a big drive in the local authority to be youth-led. It's real focus of the local authorities. That obviously helped a focus around the connection to the youth. Being able to not having recriminations if something they didn't work. They could actually then go back to the youth voice. So they've got participation of youth as part of this work, and say, you know, it didn't work here, let's work again, let's try something new. And then in particular a focus on quality provision for some sort of really key targeted underserved groups, as opposed to the numbers through the door. So that's what they felt were some of the key things that helped them to work together, that the local pilot afforded. And then we'll just move through here quite quickly. What we've identified here is that it's not just about being able to work together, but it's also built morale within the team. They feel like they've actually got new knowledge, they've got a wider team, you know, more people to kind of work with, and that's helped to bed in that collaboration also. And the interesting thing about this in Salford is that the collaboration of these two agencies has now led to a wider network of partners coming in and focusing in on, oh, well, what's going on here? Can we be part of that as well? So that core has really started to actually build out into a wider network with lots more opportunities coming on, and they're detailed here. So what that allowed us to do was then to say, right, well, okay, our theory was kind of backed up, you know, but what was actually really important was this ring-fence time, the mutual understanding, respect and trust, reinforced reciprocity between those two agencies. But then when we went to test this with the wider local authorities in the other places, we were asking them, you know, what's significant to you? What difference do you think has made a difference here in Salford in this example that perhaps isn't working or is working in your locality? And they highlighted, again, I'm not going to go into detail, but they highlighted, you know, there's a difference when you've got competing personal agendas and poor interpersonal relationships versus people who are able to compromise and understand where there's complementary agendas towards a common purpose, and detail coming out here about where actually sometimes you haven't got that. And then others reflecting on where they currently sit is that they feel like it's quite one-sided. So they're trying to work in collaboration, and the people they're working with are actually saying, oh, yeah, that's great. Yes, I'll have some more of that. I'll have some more of that. But it's not reciprocal. So it's not feeling like a genuine sort of bedded in partnership. So this is where we're starting to sort of test the ideas of the theory with other places. And finally, we end this chapter with a kind of revisiting of the working assumptions, which then because of that test we did with the other localities, we kind of recognise actually where there's historical power imbalances, then we, you know, further work needs to be done to be able to address some of those things as well. And people are seem to only be willing to work in partnership where it doesn't cause harm to their own job or organisational security. So when you start to outline those things, perhaps it sounds like common sense, but actually, you know, what we've got is a real evidence base to be able to illustrate that these are the things that are important to that change. And then we highlight at the end, you know, kind of going back to a sort of a theory of change here, you know, and maybe that's a bit too small for you to see, but it's where, you know, the aligned principles, common goals, productive and working partnerships around those common goals, and coordination driving effectiveness and efficiencies. But at this point, we wouldn't necessarily say that was a sustainable partnership. And what we've seen in this work is that actually there's this kind of a cyclical approach of working in partnership where you're building mutual understanding, and that you jointly solve problems over a number of different projects or different issues. And then that's what's leading to that embedded practice and process. And actually that's leading to, yes, more opportunities for physical activity in more places, physical activity supporting other objectives, but actually also importantly, this morale, joy at work, and then that broadening network that I mentioned before. So I'm just going to stop sharing that one and just highlight that for the professional audience, we also developed just an infographic that sums all of that up in a one pager. You have to be familiar with the report to be able to use this, but what we found is our kind of colleagues working in place just use this as an aid memoir to help them to discuss it with other places. So I've obviously whistled through that, but I will stop now and open for questions just in terms of the process that we went through and the way that we've laid out the information to see if that's making sense, resonating, or if anyone has any challenges.
Katie, there are a few comments on the chat, so maybe we can go through them, and then obviously people can come forward and ask any direct questions as well. Just a really quick one from me though to start off, because obviously we have explanatory frameworks and we have explanatory statements, and for example, sometimes explanatory statements are positioned as program theories of change, or some people are using context mechanisms and outcomes within their places. So what, you know, maybe a bit of a stupid question, but an important one. What is the difference in terms of illustrating the look of an explanatory framework? Like, show me your explanatory framework. What is it? What does it look like versus the explanatory statements bit? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. So for me, the explanatory framework is probably at a more abstract level. By that I mean kind of zoomed out, yeah, and that covers not necessarily the entirety, but like a good swathe of the things that you're trying to explain. And the reason why we have an explanatory framework is that when we get into the detailed explanatory accounts, then you can actually go down into rabbit warrens very easily and explain one little thing to the kind of the nth degree, but it doesn't necessarily pull back into what are you trying to do overall. So the explanatory framework is an organizing framework to be able to like zoom in and zoom out, but you're connected to like what is the overall pattern of, you know, what you're trying to achieve. So the explanatory framework in that example would be those 5 enablers of change, and the explanatory accounts and the program theories and the detail is in the, you know, sustainable collaboration, and then the detail within that being around, you know, reciprocal partnership, time, all of those things that I sort of described in more detail.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah. Oh, Simon.
Katie, just a quick question, and you'll have told me this so many times, but is there a difference between an explanatory account and a program theory, or are we just using terms for this pretty much the same thing?
Yeah, it's the same thing.
I'll have it tattooed on my hand now, so I don't have to ask you again.
So to be honest, the reason why we erring towards explanatory accounts, and you might say this is rubbish, but is that I think when you say the word theory, people get really scared and think it's like got to be very, very, clever and backed up by, huge amounts of data. And ideally, that's where we will get to. But what we're trying to do is make clear our assumptions, and so rather than necessarily worry people about the notion of I'm coming up with a theory, is actually just try to explain what you're doing. Why do you think this is going to work? Why do you think it's going to lead to change? In what circumstances will it lead to change? In what circumstances it might it not? And so that's why we've used that probably more lay terms in order to try to get that across.
And yeah, Katie alluded to it as well, Simon. Assumptions and beliefs a lot of the time are used instead, because usually when you look to literature, it explains what program theory is. We'll say these are assumptions and beliefs that people have about something. So yeah, they mean the same thing, and I think it's important to make it as straightforward as possible. Just looking at the chat, Sarah, you've posted a really interesting comment, just working through them at the start. Sarah, did you want to do that instead of me? You're here, might as well.
No, thanks. So I think one of the challenges we're having as, I suppose, external evaluator, and then coming in, obviously looking at what NELP want and what the local LDP want, is really what I suppose the requirements are, I suppose, from a national perspective versus local perspective, and what exactly you want through, I suppose, that explanatory account. So I suppose one of the things we were looking at with Doncaster is obviously they're really interested in the realist approach and CMOs, and kind of trying to unpick the research and use that to guide some of their evidence. Is that, I suppose, the level of detail that you are looking for ideally in terms of the work that you're doing to try and start unpicking it into more CMOs and using a realist evaluation? Or is it more kind of, as you said, theoretical, kind of the explanatory accounts bit? Or is it?
And I totally, I can understand where you're coming from, Sarah, and I would probably err towards there being less distinction than perhaps it feels. So one of the issues, me and Kev have this conversation quite a lot, like we really are realist researchers, and we're comfortable with the notion of a CMO, which is, for those of you who are not realist researchers, means context, mechanism, outcome. But what we understand that to do is layer jargon upon jargon upon jargon. And actually, particularly in complex systems work, the notion of a mechanism and an outcome is very fuzzy and blends from one time to another, or dependent on a different perspective, it's something different. So we actually feel that we really are wedded to an understanding of the world that is based on, there are these underlying kind of features that do have powers and liabilities that can create change. That's the realist bit, that is real, as it were. But in having to sort of stick rigidly to a particular sort of terminology, which perhaps isn't that helpful in this context. Sorry, I shouldn't use the word context. Isn't that helpful? So it's my strong belief that what we're trying to do is unearth and explain these patterns of change by looking at underlying sort of causal processes. I'm less wedded to you then writing them out in CMOs. Is that clear enough, Sarah?
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, because I think with some of this work we've been doing with Doncaster, and obviously looking at the realist approach, I think then it is complicating things. I think struggling with their theory of change, just articulating that, then moving on to CMOs and things like that. So actually, no, it is. I think we thought it was just more explanation and more of an explanatory account, and that's really helpful in us being able to guide Doncaster and guide what is actually needed.
And sometimes a CMO is helpful because it gives you a thing to focus on, or a heuristic to follow. But I mean, I definitely don't get into a kind of debate around, what is a mechanism and what is a context and all of that kind of thing, because actually it's really, to me, it's sort of missing the point of what we're trying to do is that underlying causal, but I mean, this is something that we debate within the realist community, that how helpful is that heuristic? And if you go back to Ray Pawson, who was, he wasn't the initiator of realist kind of thinking, because that goes further back, but he really popularized realist evaluation. He himself would say, you know, it's just a heuristic, it's just to disrupt thinking. It's just something that, you know, we think it's important. It's a framework for working, but it doesn't mean that, you know, you have to get really, really hung up on minutiae details there. But I do urge that kind of detail. One thing to highlight is that often, and what we've seen come back actually in terms of the process evaluations is, again, sort of theories of change. But what we're seeing, and I might even show the example from Bradford if I can just get it, is that the theories of change become equivalent to, and Susan, you can correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but equivalent to the explanatory framework, and then the program theories or the explanatory accounts then get under the skin of that. So if it would be helpful at this moment to share that example, just quickly run through that as well, and then Susan or Hannah can jump in. Do you want to just say anything, Susan? I can see you've unmuted.
No, I was getting ready to say something.
Well, I'll just quickly as well, just to build on what you said, Katie, or repeat what you said. I think it's a really important question that you've posed there, Sarah. Overall, it's a question that kind of resonates with a lot of the other places that I'm in contact with, and one of the things that we really don't want to do is kind of prescribe a methodology that is prescriptive, and it's a one size fits all. It's not like that at all. It's about the key thing for us, I suppose, that we want to try and encourage and facilitate that explanatory thinking, but it is of your freedom as to how you kind of mobilize that, because Louise mentioned makes some really good points down the chat as well around how do we bring other stakeholders into this journey, and obviously what do we mean by stakeholders? Community members, other members, part of sector integration, the system, for example, and it needs to be real for them. It needs to make sense, and we don't want to over jargonize things. So that's just what I wanted to add to that.
And what I might do is just quickly run through this, and then I might hand over to Susan for two things just to prepare you, or Hannah if Hannah's still here. I can't see her actually. But to say, your experience of writing things up in this way, well, the good, the bad, the ugly, don't worry about offending me. And then the other bit that you've been speaking to me around about how you're weaving this into discussions and conversations with just in general when you're catching up with particular sort of community connectors or that kind of thing as well. So I don't know if that will flow for you, but that's what I think might respond to some of the other questions that are coming up. So again, this is already, you can see this is perhaps a little bit more in terms of visually using a PowerPoint kind of framework or slide type framework. So here's the theory of change, which is around, the example given here is around the sharing communities and share shacks. So the kind of high level theory being about, if we are supporting people with their basic needs, then they're engaging with us and we're helping to, relieve some of the pressures that they might be experiencing. And that provides us with a kind of a better platform to be able to either introduce physical activity there or then, or build a relationship in order to encourage more physical activity in the future. So I'm not going to go into the detail of this, but what Birmingham have done, have highlighted a theory of change, which might look familiar to you, and then given a bit more detail on a particular example of the sharing kind of opportunities, which is the share shacks, and again some just some pictures to bring it to life and to sort of help people feel that they've got some connection to what does it actually look like. And then an overarching summary statement for the share shack. So in a community or place where physical activity is low, having access to a shared space in the form of a share shack may increase physical activity. Citizens are able to come together, feel connected, empowered to co-create activities and opportunities that are meaningful to them, leading to increased civic and civic participation, I think that is, and physical activity. And then what they've gone into is just some details around actually how does this work in practice. So first of all, creating the right environment, and some examples, having the right people involved,
working with and not doing to. So those of you that are familiar with community work, you're probably familiar with that kind of phrase, but actually what does this really look like in practice? Let's get some actual detail about that, and then some examples bringing it to life a little bit more. So bringing that last one to life, and then also empowering and building capacity locally. So focusing not just on, you know, offer to the community, but what do they actually bring that sort of just builds that ownership, sense of community, sense of reciprocity. And then finally, the working with different partners to strengthen that approach overall. So then there's some more information about the data that's sort of supporting this, and one area that I was kind of encouraged is actually a little bit more of that data being kind of interwoven and really sort of shown. If that's numeric or qualitative data, then it doesn't matter, but just to really back up some of the assertions that are made here, and some final statements to kind of bring that together. And then also here there's a direction of travel. What's coming up next? What do they plan to do, both in terms of the development of share shacks, but also further data gathering exercises that would really test those theories in more context and in more detail. Susan, do you want to jump in here in terms of your kind of reflections on the process?
Yes, where do I start? The reason we chose to write it in that way, prepare it in that way, I guess, was that it was easier. It was also easiest to swallow that way. We've mostly in the last couple of years done our evaluation reports in that methodology, which allows us to put on the imagery, the data, infographics, etc. And depending on the subject in hand, it will be a different mix. We had already been thinking as part of the programme, you know, the conditions and enabling factors, but I guess not being able to articulate in a framework. Now, it doesn't mean that it was easy when it came to writing this up, because the bit I struggled with, I guess, was the statements part was quite hard, because it was almost like sometimes we were retrofitting the statements to then fit the evidence. But actually, when we had a bigger discussion, we had a theory of change, so we did have an overarching statement. It was what that overarching statement would be, and as Katie's highlighted, it was quite a generic overall, all catching, you know, if you do some of these things in a share shack where there's low activity, then you'll get increased activity, but it's not very specific. So we had that overarching one. We did know as the share shack started to come to life and we started to test that overarching statement and the theory of change, that we were seeing those conditions come into play and how they enabled physical or civic activity. So then it was either strengthening that insight or info with the data, the stories gathering, and in the food example, we've got surveys with the participants as well. So there's a blend of insight we then were looking for, or metrics, as it were, to prove or disprove. And as we did that, we then further expanded the statements, which is the last page that Katie showed you, actually going a bit deeper. So rather than that all-catching explanatory statement, it's well, actually, you need the right conditions to be able to and then, but it doesn't say what the conditions are in the statement, but the slide with the detail highlights what those conditions are, specifically where it talks about having the right people. Yes, it's still a generic statement, but in the detail, it actually says, you know, it's very specifically says there's somebody in there that's qualified in, I think it was qualified in coaching physical activity. So they were able to do X, Y, and Z quickly, develop some boxing classes, etc. They were able to advise one of the participants that came to boxing class, who was kind of semi-amateur, who wanted to actually teach it. She advised him what coaching courses to take and then how he could then teach it in the share shack itself. So I think what I'm saying is it was quite hard to get our head around first as to how to put all of this down into an accessible format that made sense and flowed, because for us, flow is really important. You know, start with the background, start with some context, explaining something, putting the evidence, summing it up, next steps. So that's quite difficult. But once I had a bit of a chat, I think with our sporting colleagues as well, once we got our head around it and that we were in the right direction, we just kind of went for it then and put that down. Now, as you can tell with the next steps, this is just where we are now. There's more in doing that. We just thought, oh, actually, what about this though? We haven't been able to test this, or we haven't been able to see this. So what are the next steps for us? And that's the bit that we probably haven't been able to yet show, but we've been working towards, which is do the conditions that work in this example. So with the share shacks, it's very specifically laden with share shack. But if you took that to one of our other share shack models, because we've got pop-ups as well, we've got like a semi-mobile share shack in a container. If you take those conditions, will it work in those kind of share shack? And that's the bit that we're testing now. Because I think that will really enrichen what we're showing. And it's kind of where you've gone with Manchester, because you said, well, is this going to work in different contexts? You've done it by looking at different localities, haven't you? We're doing it by looking at different permutations, I guess, of that project or that model. What it's really helped us to think about going forward is how to build in systematically. I think I put it in my chat, what I'd like to learn, and me and Hannah would like to know more, is how to build it into our everyday evaluation work. So that at the end of the 6 months, we're not scrambling around thinking, oh, yeah, how are we going to put this all together? It should actually just be a natural process of collating it into a presentation or a document. So that's the bit for us, is how do we make it part of our everyday life, not just as an evaluation team, but the projects, the people who work in the projects, the other organisations, the project team. Yeah,
that's good, Susan, and thank you. I found that really helpful to hear. You know what the process you've been through. Just on that last point, I have gone on a really big learning journey myself from the start of this work, with a kind of very sort of academic theoretical hat on, to thinking, really believing that people, like, it's really empowering and transformative when people really think about what is it that's actually genuinely working and what's not, and actually, particularly when we're thinking about systems transformation, actually, what do I need to unlearn in order for this to work, or what processes are really getting in our way? And so I really believe in the sort of power of this kind of way of thinking, but I absolutely know that just writing up in a report does not do the job of sharing that or gaining people's buy-in. Now, my only real revelation around that is that it's in the conversation that the transformational thinking actually happens, or the penny drop moment happens. So I totally 100% accept what you're saying, what Louise is saying about visually representing things in a way which is accessible, but I would be so interested to continue this discussion now in terms of, is that in itself enough to kind of really transfer those findings, or would you agree that it's also in how you might use those findings in conversation or in practice, in the project work with people, to sort of really bring those into the kind of design phase or the discussion phase or the decision making phase, that it just brings it to life in discussion in real time. Louise?
I couldn't agree with you more, Katie. I think this is so complex, not just in the building of the evidence, because I think I think if you come from an academic background, you naturally lend yourself to go, right, what's all the evidence? And then I'm going to write it, like, in a report, and then I'm going to translate it. But actually, I think for everyone, whatever background you're coming from, that's so crucial, because it's a building block. So but text is only one form of communication. The visual is only one form of communication. If you want to bring people along with this kind of mindset about explaining what they do, then you have to have those verbal conversations. That it's, it even goes down to some of the unspoken things, the kind of reactions people have around the fear of doing this, or the acceptance of it, or when some people get it and some people don't, you end up in a row in a meeting. I think it speaks to how any of this gets done. So I totally agree with you. It's not just about representing stuff at the end, it's about what happens in between, in the communication of this, because that affects how you build the evidence, how you analyze. Yeah,
I think it's I know that Tom and Susan have now got their hands up, but I just wanted to really quickly come in, because I need to add a little bit more complexity to my involvement in the session in a second. But I think that comes down, Louise, to kind of like, how we go about disseminating our findings, or what our theory is, around communicating what is going on and bringing people into that kind of journey, I suppose. Because we're in a situation at the moment at Hartpury where we've just produced a massive report around 4 key areas for Active Essex, but that's just the first part. It's like, how do you then kind of like unravel that learning so it actually means something? So I just wanted to say that really quickly. I in the spirit of complexity I have another session that I need to go to now, not on Teams, but I'm going to leave this call running in the background. It's going to leave it recording. So I'll be here, but I won't be here. So I'll obviously just wait for it to end, if that's okay. And I'll let you guys carry on. I just wanted to say that in case you tried to speak to me and I didn't respond, Katie, everyone. So
that's fine. I knew you were going.
Yeah.
It's a good communication there, Kev.
Thank you.
I think you made me a host as well, so I should be able to do everything.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I'll just leave it. I'll leave it running anyway. I'm going to go off to this session now, but it's great to see everybody, and we'll see you. We'll arrange time for the next learning clusters subcluster session for this group. But I'll let you carry on the conversation.
Yeah, just put yourself on mute. Oh, yeah, it's done. Bye bye. Tom.
Joe is with me here on the call from Withensea, and this is some work, Joe, you did, but I just want to introduce it, if I may, because I think the others might find it useful in this discussion. So what you're asking the question about, how do we disseminate and how do we use this within the context of the project as a whole and beyond? But so this is just an example of using the data as we go along. And the thinking was basically, well, we don't know if we've got it right. We've drawn up this little model that we think, and it's our expectations of what we think is happening. And then, Joe, you tried it out with the guys who were doing it on the ground. What happened when you did?
Yeah, so are you on about the pace one?
Yeah.
So we had a new project that we were part of in the community called Pace, and it was essentially, the idea is it's going to be a wider community network for Withensea to get people to network together and help with improving physical activity in the area. So I created a kind of a framework, it's more like I don't know how to describe it, like a framework from time 1 and then a framework for time 2, kind of more like a chronological order of what was going on. So I created that for what we'd got from where this thing started from to where it was at that time, and then showed it to the working group that were leading the Pace session kind of thing. And they all seemed to like it because it was easier than it being like a big written report, in the sense of it kind of explained what was happening and why, and using the CMO as kind of like a way to describe what was happening and kind of why. But actually, my question is, with that CMO model, which we're starting to use more, is there a way to get more description without just overloading it with a load of words, if that makes sense in it? Because like you've got you can have your context, and then you'll have your mechanism, and then you'll have your outcome, and you try to summarize it, but then there's all the loads of other stuff that you want to mention, but I don't want to put it on the model, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, I totally get what you mean, Joe. It's so you have to think about, for me, I think about this in terms of sort of nested layers of information according to who you are talking to. So you might just use that high level diagram and talk around it for a workshop. You have the data and the information in the back of your head that you want to perhaps bring in, but you don't need to bombard everybody with that.
Yeah.
If you think about what Sport England's job of work at the moment is, which NELP are trying to support them with, it's actually to understand, what does make a difference, and what difference does that make, and how does that relate to their ambition to broaden and deepen and, all the other things that they want to do with the Uniting the Movement strategy. So therefore, we need that data. It doesn't really, to me, we're looking at mixed methods data. We're not specifically looking for qualitative or quantitative data, but a range of data that helps to demonstrate, is the change actually happening that you think is happening? How and why is it happening? So So it's difficult for us to say with any conclusiveness that what, you know, how to inform a strategy and a broadening strategy if we don't have that data to base it in. So if the information's coming into Sport England, then at least being able to point to that data that supports those assertions, I would say, is important. If you're using that with your local stakeholders, it's probably horses for courses. You know, somebody who's making a decision about the investment of a budget then probably needs a bit more data to support an assertion. But if you're just trying to build up a momentum, partnership, a network, or what have you, then less, and allowing people to bring their perspectives on the matter is to its advantage. Does that make sense?
So the key bit about the conversation, so bringing it into the conversation, so, and then orienting that forward. So is it right? And then what happens next? Enable a little bit of us to imagine a little bit better what the next steps might be to test our theory a little bit too. But I think what you're saying is also maybe the write-up isn't perhaps for the on the ground group necessarily, if that's not the horses for courses bit is there are different needs for evidence elsewhere.
I would say so, and the guidance. So we're really conscious that we, you know, obviously we've been in post for, actually it's about 18 months now, which has gone really fast and scarily fast, but we didn't want to come in and then, you know, impose upon everybody sort of, you know, a new frame. But we recognise that there was an opportunity to sort of develop new ways of thinking and new evaluation approaches, which might help stimulate some of those kind of fruitful conversations and help Sport England to have a sense of what is it that they could kind of scale, because you can't just lift and shift interventions. What can you actually scale, and what evidence do we have for that? So we were sort of balancing those two different kind of priorities, as it were. And so what we really want you to focus on is developing the evidence and the evaluation and learning opportunities that are going to help your local stakeholders to move forward. And that might be, that is to be determined almost by your own kind of local group of stakeholders. But in addition, that's why we've only asked for these kind of deeper dives or explanatory accounts on a small selection of what you're doing, so that it doesn't completely consume everybody. And so it might be that the two are the same thing and that they are doing the same job, but it might be different depending on your local circumstances. So that's when the guidance comes out, which will be this week. And I apologise because Jess has actually been chasing me, and it's my fault there's a bit of a hold up. But it is going to kind of keep on that line that ideally there's some coherence between, you know, what your local stakeholders want and what you're giving to us in sort of more of that data, that detailed data. But you still have that kind of autonomy in place to be corresponding to the local needs of the local stakeholders. Okay, I just want to pick up on a couple of the questions that are in the chat now. So I'm going to now scroll up and through. I don't know where I still saw it, Simon, but did you start with that programme theory? You're on mute.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I was in the example that you showed earlier. Did you start with an explicit programme theory? And then that drove research questions, which then created the evidence, which you then wrote up, or is that not the case?
So we actually started with a really incredibly complex and horrible explanatory framework, which I had derived from the literature review, right back when we started. So that's back in 2019 now.
Yeah.
And then that immediately made everybody run for the hills. And so we developed a kind of a survey and a kind of like topic guides for sort of interacting with people and to capture our notes and observations.
Yeah.
And then from that we distilled it down using a statistical method into those 5 enablers. So it has been
born out of some interaction when, you know, connection with local stakeholders, their ideas. But now we're at the point where we've developed our understanding of some of those enablers and we've got that leading edge. Then we were interested in what is it we want to know about here, and where are we seeing some interesting things develop. Let's start with our theory, develop our questions, go and test it, come back, you know, understand what it is, and then take that as a story. So just to highlight, when we shared it with the other localities, we didn't share it in written format at all. It was literally a story told with the notes of the explanations in there for people to then, I was asking them to do some active listening, so, you know, post-it notes and taking notes of what they felt resonated and what they felt was, you know, distinct from their own set situation, and then that derived another discussion. So it's very iterative. It's a kind of zigzag between the theoretical statements and the data and the conversation, and back again and back again and back again.
So although it wasn't explicit, it sounds like it was explicit in your head because you've done all of the research, you've done all of the thinking around the theory. So was the theory in your head which then drove the research process?
So it's threefold. It's sort of the expertise, if you want to call it that, from, you know, from coming from that knowledge base, the stakeholders' assumptions and perspectives themselves, and I would say that's really important, and almost it's kind of more important than the, you know, what you're bringing, to make sure you've got a sense of what that is from the stakeholders themselves, and then any data that you already have, because sometimes you have data, say from observations or from a survey that you're not expecting, and it makes you think, oh, hang on a minute, there's something going on here, so we need to investigate this a little bit more. So there's no set way of you know, how you must create that theory in the first instance, and it will depend on who's there. And one thing that is not for this session, but one thing that we're really keen to acknowledge is whose perspectives are not represented in these theories and whose perspectives are not influencing what's going on in place, and whether this kind of almost shadow representation of the setting or the place, we could get into that in some ways, but that's not for now. That's for a later date, before everyone starts to panic. I'm not going to ask you to build up shadow theories. I hope that's okay. So I'm just going to keep scrolling through the questions. Louise has got preliminary principles, not a sort of specific theory of change. And actually, are you contesting whether that's even helpful, Louise? Do you want to explain?
No, I think we're probably a stage back from producing what we'd call the explanatory framework. So we've got a set of principles that's in a report, in a text written form, in the way that you've shown it, and now it's about, and there are very much missing voices from that, in my view. So I would want to build more evidence and have more discussions about refining what I'm calling principles into a set of what we might call drivers, like you've got in the GM model, and then developing it on from there. So we're a bit further away, really.
And you know, it's not a race in the sense, because it's in the process of this work, if done with that sensitivity to the local stakeholders and their perspectives, that the actual real value comes. You know, my needs to have to do a synthesis of this work is less important than those processes of, because that's, if this is going to be effective, you know, in terms of a place-based approach, that's where the learning needs to happen, not in an ivory tower in an academic institution. So that's from my point of view, you know, why it's important that we work through these challenges together at the pace that is right for the places, rather than, you know, being kind of you know, pitting one against another, as it were.
I think what would be useful for us, and you know this, Katie, is just getting a sense around how other projects are, what capacity other projects have for doing this, because I think Southall probably is the least well-resourced project around evaluation capacity. It's me. So, and I think that other people have not huge teams, but I think some people have taken it. I know embedded researcher approaches and maybe kind of a distributed approach to how data is getting collected and recorded. And it's just worth thinking about, I think, in terms of messaging back and, you know, it's part understanding the capacity for this or capacity issues and making sure that evaluation is properly resourced. I think is important for all projects to know, and I think some are more established in that respect. That's the sense I get.
Yeah, and I would say that is definitely true. We have a huge spectrum in terms of the amount of evaluation and researcher time, you know, with some pilots very well endowed in that respect, and even being led by research teams, through to others that don't have the research capacity or evaluation capacity kind of baked into their work. Now, Kev is not here, but what Kev would be saying at this moment in time is that evaluation and learning is everyone's business, and I think incredibly important when we're talking about complex systems change, where there isn't going to be a set answer. And so it's kind of incumbent, I would say, on most stakeholders involved in the work to at the very least to sort of develop a reflective practice in order to kind of like make shifts and changes, which might suggest that there is evaluation happening all of the time, and it's the question mark is around capturing it. I think that goes back to what Susan was saying, is that it's not that people aren't being evaluative in their work, it's just how do we actually capture the data which is of that level of thoughtfulness and usefulness in a systematic way to be able to share it effectively. There are some examples. We do have embedded researchers. So Simon is an embedded researcher with South Tees, hosts weekly reflection sessions, captures the notes on behalf of the team. So that's one model. Within the Pennine Lancs pilot, there's an emphasis on kind of distributed learning pods. So they buddy up and kind of, you know, compelled to sort of spend time reflecting together, and people don't like doing it to begin with, but then find it invaluable afterwards. So there are different models out there which don't necessarily rely upon a huge weighty academic contract, but I hear what you're saying. It is a challenge.
Yeah, and I agree. You know, evaluation should be the mindset of everyone, but you know, the reality is that the level of work needs resourcing in some way, shape or form. Otherwise it's not going to be sustainable, let alone high quality. And I, you know, if I'm honest, I think probably Sport England have rolled back on this from the kind of messaging they were giving about evaluation partners years ago, which has allowed some groups to drop the evaluation off the agenda, and I don't think it's helpful, but that's another conversation.
Yeah, okay. So and so I think it goes back into a little bit what perhaps Sarah was saying, or what Tom was saying, Susan was saying, is that what we need to do with the evaluation is make it be valuable to the local stakeholders. Hence, they will invest in it and see the work and see it's not just about ticking a box, creating a report for Sport England, but actually something that can be used themselves. So I think, you know, yes, Tom.
Yeah, sorry, Louise, I don't know if you've experienced this or not. I know maybe others have as well, but it's been massive turning points in the project that I've been working with at Withensea, when the project manager, and there've been a new project manager in, when the project manager has got it, that, oh, this isn't about delivery, it's about learning. And it's that, it's about learning. And that just radically changed their perspectives on this and their willingness to engage with things in a completely different way. So I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying that if that
I agree with you. I mean, again, there's been some, I think, challenges around who is responsible for the process learning report, whether that's evaluation, what the role of the evaluator is. I mean, these are all wider discussions, but yeah, I think developing that kind of culture of learning is really important.
It just reminds me that we have developed a public narrative as part of the outputs of Sport England, and I think it's it's been through a few iterations, and we're working with a comms specialist now to try to make it more accessible. So that will be coming soon as well. If it's probably just useful to direct people's attention to that again, not because it's perfect by any stretch, but because it helps give some framing and you know, welcome feedback on that ongoing. Sarah.
I was just going to say, we are obviously external evaluators and we're supporting Doncaster LDP, so we obviously do have that capacity. But I think obviously one of the challenges is their capacity to have the time to get together and do the learning. We've been working really hard to try and move. We do reflective learning sessions, we do logs, we do different things to collect information, all of which has its challenges around time and capacity. We've tried to move the reflective learning sessions, although we do mention there to inform process learning reports. We've tried to focus them much more on actual delivery, and actually sometimes by the end of the reflective learning session, we have nothing to put in the process learning report, but there's been 2 hours of discussion and the LDP have moved forwards with some of their objectives and planning and things that they want to do. So I think as evaluators, we've definitely moved away from, if something looks like it's going in a direction that works for the LDP, let them go. We'll help facilitate that discussion in a different way. It might not be about evidence for the evaluation, but actually then everyone comes out of it thinking we've made some progress for the LDP and the objectives, and then we have to go back and speak to people and get the information we need for the reports and things. But definitely letting go of that kind of expectations. Yeah. But the time and capacity for people to come together sometimes is the challenging thing. But definitely making sure that it has double value, that we aren't just sitting there grilling them on something for 2 hours that they're like, we know this already. Actually letting it go in a different direction has definitely been supported the work.
Well, you get loads of explanation then. I think when you observe that happening, you get loads of evidence around explaining things. So yeah, I totally agree.
I was going to say, I think that is that to me is data and could go into a report if there was consent for that. And the other thing is, I think there are some things that are implicit which can be made more explicit in these making these explanatory accounts clear. So for example, learning and adapting might be implicit in terms of some of the work that's done, but if you develop with, you know, obviously don't do it to the teams, but if you develop with them as that actually if learning is important, what do we mean by learning? What's the purpose of learning? What would we see if learning was actually happening? i.e. we're not just having a talking shop to kind of just kind of moan about things, but we're actually creating a reflection on all kinds of data. It might be, you know, academic evidence, or it could be insight from a story that, or, you know, in order to reflect on our practice and change our practice or keep going with something if it's working. You know, that to me is where we're looking what learning constitutes. So you develop a program theory or an explanatory account around that, and then you can legitimately say, well, we've been trying to, you know, understand how this actually works in practice, and these are the things, these are the conditions that seem to support that, and these are the things that seem to get in the way of that. So I wouldn't say, Sarah, necessarily that, you know, I hear what you're saying. The point is that you can see that it's having value for the team, but you might also consider thinking about that as something to report upon in process learning reports.
We've then used the evidence because ahead of it, we always say get the consent for people at the start. So we often then we'll choose maybe what we want the process learning report to focus on with the team, obviously, but then often that will change following the sessions, and being not wedded to actually this process learning report is going to be on this subject because we've decided it at the start. Actually, all this other interesting stuff came up, and we can focus it in on some of that, and maybe we'll go back and try and find a bit more about the things we wanted to start with. But it's very much guided, I suppose, by the team, and that learning then will go into the reports, as you say.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to highlight is actually is you know, we are on this cadence of 6 monthly reporting. The consensus was that was helpful because it helps, you know, having these kind of deadlines just helps focus the mind and get reports out and things like that. But it wouldn't bother me in the slightest if actually you were popping up, you know, 2, 3, 4 pages on certain things over the course of the 6 months, and that's what was being sort of then, you know, just collated at that 6 monthly interval. Because certain things take a long time to shift, don't they? But certain things require a bit of more responsivity for it to actually be helpful and useful in real time in the local environment. So yeah, don't necessarily let that cadence kind of constrain the activity, the evaluation activity. Okay, I think it's been fine to stray off a little bit in terms of the content, but I'm just conscious of having this opportunity to kind of really explore if there's anything more I can do to explain or to respond to any challenges on our kind of our request to get that explanatory detail. Is there anything else that can that you would benefit from just talking over, or if anyone else has an example to share as well or wants to shout about their work, then we've got some time now to do that. Yes, Sarah.
I was going to say, the only thing for me is, I suppose, is we've been working with Doncaster to try and encourage them to think that some of their work is explanatory already. I think with the new framework coming in, I think they thought we're not doing any of this, and that's not to say it can be improved. It needs to be more detailed, and I think they had that feeling that because it was something new terminology, new words, new things that were coming out, or we aren't doing this at all. So I think we're obviously trying to support them to say we have been trying to explain things as we go along. It's probably not in a framework, or it needs more detail. It definitely needed to be kind of started to unpick more. But I think trying to, I suppose, the challenge for us is supporting them to realise that we were already doing some of this. They're already doing some of it. We're working with them to do some of it. And I think hopefully following this, we can talk to them again and say it doesn't have to be in this CMO. It doesn't have to be, so it doesn't have to be rigid. It is very much about, it is just more about the explanation and kind of unpicking that. But I think this will help anyway. So I suppose it's just, yeah, a reiteration of, yeah, pilots are probably doing more of it than they think, maybe just not. Well, especially for Doncaster, they're doing some of it already, and it's about enhancing it rather than scrapping everything and starting again.
Yeah, I think it's often, and I know Rob Vincent's been working closely with Doncaster, so I'm less familiar with the detail of their work, but often the tendency with reporting, you know, it's one of our behaviours, isn't it, that we need to think about, is to talk a lot about you know, what's happening, and you know, be keen to demonstrate the growth in things. You know, we've got X number of partners before, and now we've got Y number of partners, and those kind of things, and that's great, and that tells us something. But I guess the point that we're trying to make is that if we don't know how and why those things have changed, then we don't stand to learn as much from the fact that there has been change. And so yeah, so it's just there will be a future session, I think, on integration of data, in order to say, well, what do we do when we've got bits of data here and there, which is very common across the pilots, of lots of disparate bits of data. What do we do with that? How do we bring that together? And my argument would say is that those explanatory frameworks also help you to bring these disparate bits of data into a coherent space, where maybe your quantitative data shows you something about the outcome patterns that you're observing. Your qualitative or observational data shows you something about how and why those changes are occurring. It's just it's a way of actually bringing some of that data together. Thanks, Sarah. That's a really helpful reflection, though. Simon, who should own the explanatory framework and the explanatory accounts? It's a really good question. My instinct is to say that ideally it's owned by everybody, and it's people recognise themselves and their work within that framework. I think that's probably an idealistic statement, and that often it will be the person with responsibility for the kind of evaluation that is holding it and socialising it, shall we say. Mm-hmm. What's your thoughts?
No, I agree with you. If it's idealistic, it might also be imperative that everybody owns it. If we've just said in earlier conversations that all of this work is everybody's business, then unless we all are part of creating that explanatory framework, then it's not going to connect us all. But that takes some doing. But for me, it's critical
Yeah.
If we're all, if it's about collective action and collective learning and then collective improvement, then we've all got to be involved in that, or else it just becomes the you know, the remit detached and the remit of the researcher.
Yeah.
And then I think we get into and then I think we get into the problem of translation, and how do we use that information to encourage change?
Yeah, I think you're right. And let's work towards that. How do we do it in a way that's meaningful? It's interesting that the explanatory framework they have in South Tees, the common purpose model, if anyone's familiar with it, they use that as a frame often when working with partners and also when talking to us in the sort of process meetings. But the extent to which it is really a guiding mental model for all of the team, I would say, is variable. So yeah, let's keep thinking about that. Tom. Oh, Tom, you're on mute. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks. I was just wondering if maybe because some of the explanatory frameworks will be for quite small things, maybe the ownership should be for those people that are invested in that in some way, rather than necessarily everybody. So if it's about bikes, maybe it's to be people who are affected by the bikes and people who are involved in doing the thinking about.
That's true. Not everybody needs to have oversight of everything. And actually, we've struggled with this in terms of, do you need everybody to be working in a way which is really deeply reflective? If some people's role within this broad constellation of stakeholders isn't necessarily to have that sort of role. And it's my tendency is to say I think it would improve if everybody was, but equally you have to accept that actually it's just not realistic in terms of what's going to happen. Joe?
Yeah, I was just with what Tom said there on on smaller projects, because the way we've gone about it so far, we did design a couple of frameworks for the last process evaluation that Tom helped write, but then more recently we've started to use them, like I mentioned with that PACE one. We've started to create little frameworks for loads of individual little projects that are going on in Active Witnessy, who are being led by one person. In terms of Active Witnessy, certainly he's been led by one person, and we've kind of created those little diagram frameworks based on informal interviews we've done with the team and stuff. So, and the idea is that I then have been the one that's necessarily creating that diagram from the discussion, but then we take it back to the individual in the team to get their thoughts on it, to make sure that it's actually accurate with what's going on, rather than it being just my perspective on it.
Yeah. And then it's like their little one that
so it's kind of like,
that sounds like I'm infantilizing it, but I don't mean that. I mean that they've got their bit which pertains to their specific role. Yeah, that's an interesting idea, Joe. Like that idea.
Yeah, so but in terms of what Simon was saying with like the ownership, it more, rather than it being like, oh, it's just Joe's thing that he'd made in the evaluation thing, it's more than just me kind of thing. If that makes sense.
Yeah. And so then what I would be really helpful to see is then how do those little ones connect to the kind of overarching explanatory frameworks, or I mean, you don't have to use the NELP conceptual framework, but potentially that, so that it sort of has that it has the ability for us to transfer what might be learnt in that small example to other elements of the work, because that's the other bit that I haven't really laboured today. But when we have these kind of patterns that emerge and some data and details around that, it helps us to, whilst we can't lift and shift interventions, we might learn more about what are the kind of conditions and things that need to be in place in certain circumstances for this to start to progress forward, and what are the conditions and features in place that might be needed in other circumstances to progress forward. So having that connection to the broader theme is also very helpful. Okay, we're 1 minute to time. I'm incredibly grateful to you all for your questions and your thoughtful contributions. I hope that was helpful just in bringing to light some of the ways in which this has been tackled. As I say at the beginning, we are on this together in terms of a journey to improve and to really focus in on that
the quality of the data, the quality of the thinking, and the ability to share and support learning. So very happy for further feedback, other ideas, other examples to be shared. And I know that this group will carry on with Hannah's facilitation as we go. So sure, just the door's always open though. So if you do want to specifically come back to me or Kev on this, please do feel free. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Katie.
See you later.
Really good.
Thank you.
I'll try not to lose the recording now. I'm just going to pause while everyone leaves and hope I can finish it.